The restaurant was the kind of place where silence had weight. Every sound, cutlery touching porcelain, the low murmur of distant conversations, the soft glide of polished shoes across marble, felt measured, controlled, expensive. Light spilled gently from recessed fixtures, reflecting off crystal glasses and the smooth surface of white tablecloths that had never known a wrinkle. Beyond the tall glass walls, the city stretched upward, glittering and alive, a reminder of power and money stacked layer upon layer. At the center of it all sat a man who looked entirely at home. His posture was relaxed, almost careless, as if the space had been built around him rather than the other way around. His suit fit perfectly, dark and sharp, the kind that announced success before a single word was spoken. When he laughed, it was loud and confident, the sound of someone who expected agreement before finishing a sentence. Around him sat others cut from a similar cloth, executives, advisors, men with tailored jackets and polished shoes. They leaned in when he spoke, nodded at the right moments, smiled when he smiled. Tonight mattered. Everyone at the table knew it, even if no one said it out loud. A deal of enormous value was nearing its final moments, the kind of agreement that shifted markets and rewrote balance sheets. This dinner wasn't casual. It was ceremonial. Conversation flowed easily, dominated by one voice. He spoke about growth, about dominance, about how numbers bent when pushed hard enough. He joked about competitors, dismissed risks with a wave of his hand, and talked as if the future had already been signed in his name. The others listened carefully, occasionally adding comments that supported his vision without challenging it. Near the edge of the room, a server watched for an opening. She had been trained to wait. Timing mattered here. Interrupting the wrong moment could earn a sharp look or a whispered complaint. She held her notepad at her side, eyes focused but calm, scanning the table for a pause in conversation. Her uniform was simple, pressed clean, blending her into the background the way service staff were meant to. She had learned long ago how to be invisible when necessary. Minutes passed. The voices at the table never truly stopped. She took a small step forward, then another, careful not to intrude too abruptly. When she finally spoke, her tone was polite and measured, just loud enough to be heard. "Good evening. May I take your order?" The words landed like a pebble tossed into a rushing river, noticed, but barely slowing the current. He didn't look up at first. He rattled off his choice while still speaking to the man beside him, naming dishes as if reciting items from a list he had memorized years ago. She wrote quickly, her pen moving smoothly across the paper. When he finished, she glanced down at her notes, then hesitated. "I just want to confirm," she said gently. "Did you want the truffle risotto, or the seasonal pasta? They're both similar, but prepared differently." The pause that followed was subtle but sharp. He finally looked at her. For a brief moment, his expression was unreadable. Then his mouth curled into something between a smile and a laugh, a sound escaping him that carried amusement without warmth. He leaned back slightly in his chair, as if enjoying a private joke. "Are you stupid?" he said. The word hung in the air, heavy and exposed. Nearby tables went quiet. One of the men at the table stopped mid-sip, his glass hovering just short of his lips. Another shifted in his seat, eyes flicking toward the surrounding diners, suddenly aware of how public the moment had become. She didn't move. Her face remained calm, her posture steady. If the insult landed, she didn't show it. She met his gaze briefly, just long enough to register the certainty in his eyes, the confidence that the remark would pass without consequence. "It's not complicated," he continued, his voice casual, dismissive. "Just write it down." For a fraction of a second, the room felt suspended, as if waiting to see what would happen next. She nodded once. "Of course," she replied quietly. "I'll make sure it's correct." She turned away and walked toward the service area, her steps even, unhurried. At the table, he smirked, satisfied. "Unbelievable," he muttered, not bothering to lower his voice. "They really don't train people anymore." No one responded. One man cleared his throat, then decided against speaking. Another forced a thin smile, eyes fixed on the tablecloth. The conversation stumbled before slowly resuming, but something had shifted. The energy was no longer as smooth, the confidence slightly cracked. At the service station, she paused. For the first time since the exchange, her shoulders dipped, just slightly, as she took a controlled breath. Around her, other staff moved quietly, unaware or pretending not to notice. She straightened, adjusted her grip on the tray, and continued preparing the order. Across the room, seated alone at a smaller table, a man in a navy suit watched her carefully. He hadn't spoken to anyone yet. His posture was upright, his attention focused not on the skyline or the menu, but on the dynamics unfolding near the center of the room. He had noticed the insult immediately. He had seen the way the table reacted, or failed to. He had also seen how she responded. His eyes narrowed, not in anger, but in assessment. She returned with drinks a few minutes later, placing each glass with precision. Her movements were smooth, practiced. She did not avoid eye contact, nor did she seek it. She was efficient, professional, controlled. He glanced at her again, irritation creeping back into his expression. "Careful," he said lightly. "Those glasses cost more than your paycheck." The words earned a few uncomfortable chuckles from the table. She paused for half a beat, then continued arranging the final glass. "Enjoy," she said. As she turned to leave, one of the men finally spoke, his voice low. "Let's keep things professional." He waved him off. "Relax. She's staff." The phrase settled like a verdict. The man in the navy suit leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled, watching as she disappeared into the background once more. The confidence at the center table was back, louder than before, as if the insult had reinforced rather than challenged it. He talked again about leverage, about control, about how tonight was a formality. But now, eyes were watching. Not just from the surrounding tables, but from places he hadn't considered. From people he hadn't noticed. The waitress stopped near the kitchen doors, glancing back once toward the table. Her expression was unreadable, but her gaze lingered longer than necessary. At the center table, laughter rose again, but it rang hollow. And for the first time that evening, the certainty in the room felt fragile, as if one wrong move, one more careless word, might shatter it completely. The atmosphere never fully recovered after that moment. Conversation resumed, but it no longer flowed, it lurched. Every laugh came half a second too late, every agreement sounded rehearsed. The man at the center of the table didn't notice, or didn't care. He leaned into his chair, one arm draped casually over the back, talking as if the room still revolved around him. He launched into projections, describing how the acquisition would strip competitors of leverage, how jobs would be consolidated, how markets would correct themselves. He spoke in absolutes, his voice confident, polished, practiced. It was the tone of someone who had never been told no and couldn't imagine being contradicted now. The others listened, but their eyes drifted more than before. One man glanced toward the service area. Another checked his phone, then placed it face down as if reminded of something urgent he didn't want to think about. They nodded when expected, but the rhythm was off. When the first course arrived, the waitress returned, carrying plates balanced carefully on her arm. She moved with the same steady composure, placing each dish precisely where it belonged. Her hands didn't shake. Her expression didn't change. He watched her approach with a look that mixed boredom and irritation. She set his plate down last. "Be careful," he said, his tone sharp but amused. "That looks complicated. Wouldn't want you to mess it up." The words landed harder than before because they weren't loud. They were deliberate. A fork paused midair. Someone inhaled sharply, then exhaled. She looked at the plate, checked its placement, then met his eyes briefly. There was no apology in her face. No embarrassment. Only calm. "It's exactly as ordered," she said evenly. Something about her response annoyed him. It wasn't submissive enough. It didn't reinforce his sense of superiority. He smiled thinly and leaned forward. "You know," he said, lowering his voice just enough to sound conversational, "this place hires for attitude now, not brains. Don't worry. It's not your fault. A tight, uncomfortable laugh came from one end of the table. It died quickly. The man in the navy suit watched closely. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. He glanced at the other executives, reading the tension, the subtle discomfort, the collective unwillingness to intervene. He had seen this pattern before: power unchecked, cruelty disguised as humor, silence mistaken for approval. The waitress nodded once and turned away. Behind the scenes, the kitchen staff noticed the change in her demeanor, not distress, but focus sharpened into something colder. She moved with intention now, no wasted steps, no unnecessary pauses. She spoke quietly to the manager, who listened with growing concern, eyes flicking toward the table she indicated. The manager hesitated, then nodded. Back at the table, the conversation shifted to signatures and timelines. He spoke as if the deal were already complete, as if the dinner were merely a victory lap. "This will be finalized by morning," he said confidently. "There's no reason to delay." One of the men across from him finally spoke up. "There's still one approval pending." He waved his hand. "A formality. They always show up late. It's how they pretend they have power." The man in the navy suit set his napkin down slowly. Across the room, the manager approached the table, his posture formal, his expression carefully neutral. "Excuse me," he said quietly. "There's been a request to briefly pause service at this table." He frowned. "From who?" The manager hesitated, then glanced toward the service area. "From one of our guests." He scoffed. "This is a private business dinner." "Yes, sir," the manager replied. "But the request came from someone with authority to do so." Irritation flashed across his face. "Authority?" He laughed. "I doubt that." The man in the navy suit stood. The movement drew attention instantly. Chairs scraped softly. Conversations at nearby tables slowed. The room sensed a shift, even if it didn't yet understand it. "I believe that would be me," the man said calmly. He turned, surprised. "And you are?" Someone at the table shifted uncomfortably. Another looked between the two men, suddenly alert. "I've been observing," the man replied. "This dinner. This conversation. And how people are treated when you think they don't matter." The CEO's smile returned, sharp and dismissive. "Then you're welcome to enjoy the show. We're closing a deal." The man shook his head slowly. "No. You were hoping to." A silence fell, heavier than before. He scoffed again, louder this time. "This is ridiculous. Who do you think you are?" The man didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "I represent interests that determine whether this acquisition proceeds," he said. "And whether your company remains solvent afterward." A flicker of uncertainty crossed the CEO's face, gone almost instantly. "This is some kind of stunt," he said. "If you have something to say, say it." The man gestured subtly toward the service area. "I'm waiting for her." The waitress emerged a moment later. She had removed her apron. Her posture was different now, still calm, but unmistakably confident. She walked toward the table, each step measured, deliberate. Confusion spread across the CEO's face. "What is this?" he demanded. "Why is she—" The man raised a hand. "Please! Let her speak." She stopped beside the table, not behind it, not beneath anyone's gaze. She stood level with them. "You evaluated numbers tonight," she said calmly. "Margins. Projections. Risk." He stared at her, disbelief giving way to anger. "This is inappropriate." She didn't flinch. "So is calling someone stupid because you believe they can't respond." The room felt smaller, tighter. One of the executives swallowed hard. She continued, her voice steady. "This process includes observation. How leaders behave when they think no one important is watching." The man in the navy suit nodded once. The CEO pushed his chair back slightly. "Enough. This is absurd." But the confidence in his voice had thinned. She met his eyes again, and this time, there was no mistaking it. Not defiance. Not anger. Authority. You failed, she said simply. The words echoed louder than any insult had before. Around them, diners stared openly now. Phones were discreetly lowered. Forks rested untouched. The man in the navy suit spoke again. The deal is under review. He stood abruptly, face flushed. You can't do this. We already have, the man replied. The waitress stepped back slightly, her expression unreadable. The CEO looked around the table, searching for support. No one met his eyes. For the first time that night, the power he thought he owned slipped, just enough for panic to seep in. And as the silence stretched, it became painfully clear that the evening was no longer under his control. The silence stretched longer than anyone expected. It wasn't the awkward pause of a dinner gone wrong. It was the kind that pressed against the chest, forcing people to sit with what had just happened. The man who had dominated the room moments earlier stood rigid, his hands resting on the table as if gripping it might keep the ground from shifting beneath him. You failed? He repeated, a brittle laugh breaking through. This is insane. No one rushed to agree with him. The woman stood calmly, her hands folded loosely in front of her. Without the apron, without the posture of service, she seemed different, taller somehow, more grounded. Her voice, when she spoke again, carried weight, not volume. You weren't being evaluated on intelligence, she said. You were being evaluated on judgment. He scoffed, but the sound lacked confidence now. By pretending to be a waitress? That's your test? It's one of them, the man beside her said quietly. It's effective because it's honest. The executives shifted in their seats. One rubbed his temple. Another glanced toward the exit, already calculating damage control. They understood now. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It wasn't theater. This was procedure. The woman continued. When people think they hold all the power, they show who they really are. They stop performing. They stop pretending. He straightened, trying to regain control. I apologize. No, she interrupted, not harshly, but firmly. You didn't. Her eyes didn't leave his. You explained your behavior. You justified it. You repeated it. A murmur rippled through the room. He opened his mouth, then closed it. His confidence was unraveling thread by thread. You're overreacting, he said finally. Everyone here knows how business works. The man beside her shook his head. Business works on trust. Respect. Predictability under pressure. He gestured subtly toward the surrounding tables. You created volatility. She turned slightly, addressing the others now. This deal required unanimous approval from the oversight group. Not because of finances. Because of leadership risk. One of the executives leaned forward, voice low. Leadership risk? Yes, she replied. The risk that a leader's ego becomes a liability. The words landed hard. The man laughed again, but now it was sharp with fear. You're going to destroy a company over a joke? She tilted her head slightly. You're going to lose it because you didn't think the person serving your food mattered. That cut deeper than anything else she had said. He looked at her closely now, really looking for the first time. Not at her uniform, not at her role, but at her composure, her certainty. Realization flickered in his eyes, followed by something close to dread. Who are you? He asked quietly. She paused, just long enough to make the moment intentional. I represent a consortium that backs your expansion, she said. I also chair the Ethics Review Committee that approves leadership alignment. A sharp intake of breath came from the table. She continued calm and precise. We embed ourselves where behavior can't be rehearsed. Where respect is either instinctive or absent. The man in the navy suit added. We don't announce ourselves because then people perform. Tonight you didn't. His shoulders sagged slightly, the first visible crack. This is absurd, he whispered. I built this company. She nodded. And you put it at risk. He shook his head, hands spreading helplessly. You can't expect perfection. We don't, she said. We expect baseline humanity. The restaurant manager stood frozen near the edge of the room, unsure whether to intervene or retreat. Nearby diners openly watched now, no longer pretending to mind their own business. Phones buzzed softly in pockets, messages already being drafted. One of the executives finally spoke, his voice strained. Is there any path forward? She considered the question seriously, as if weighing it honestly. There was, she said. Before the second comment. Before the third. The man slammed his hand lightly on the table. So that's it? You ruin a deal because you didn't like my tone? She met his anger with calm. No. The deal is off because you revealed how you treat people you believe can't affect you. The man in the navy suit stepped closer. That's not a tone issue. That's a governance issue. The CEO looked around desperately now, seeking allies, seeking someone to challenge what was happening. But the faces around him had changed. Where there had once been agreement, there was distance. Where there had been admiration, there was calculation. One by one, they were realizing the same thing. If this was how he behaved publicly, casually, without fear, what happened behind closed doors? He sank back into his chair, breath shallow. You set me up. She shook her head. You set yourself up. She glanced at the untouched plate in front of him. We gave you every chance to correct course. All it would have taken was one moment of humility. The room remained silent. She stepped back, signaling the end of her role in the exchange. The review will conclude tonight, she said. Our decision will be communicated formally. The man in the navy suit nodded. Effective immediately. He looked at her again, his voice barely audible now. You could have said something sooner. She held his gaze. I did. You didn't listen. That was the moment it truly hit him. Not the loss of money. Not the public embarrassment. The realization that he had been warned, and dismissed the warning because of who delivered it. She turned away, picking up the folded apron from the nearby station. For a brief second she held it in her hands, then set it down neatly on the counter. I won't be serving dessert, she said quietly. The man in the navy suit pulled out his phone, already sending messages. We'll handle the rest. As she walked toward the exit, the room parted subtly, instinctively. Eyes followed her with a mix of awe and discomfort. No one spoke. No one dared. Behind her, the man sat frozen, surrounded by half-finished plates and broken certainty. The city lights beyond the glass still shimmered, indifferent as ever. But inside the room, everything had changed. And he knew, with a clarity he had never experienced before, that this wasn't a setback he could spin. This was a reckoning waiting to be finalized. The aftermath didn't arrive with shouting or slammed doors. It came quietly, methodically, the way real consequences always did. The restaurant returned to its low murmur, but the air felt different now, as if something heavy had been removed and replaced with unease. Conversations resumed at nearby tables, though voices stayed lower, careful. Everyone understood they had just witnessed something irreversible. At the center table, nothing moved. The man sat staring at the white cloth in front of him, the untouched dessert menu resting beside his plate like a cruel joke. The confidence that had once filled his posture was gone. His shoulders slumped slightly, hands resting flat as if grounding himself in the reality of the moment. One by one, the men who had sat beside him began to stand. No speeches. No reassurances. Just quiet movements, chairs sliding back, jackets being pulled on. A few offered stiff nods, professional, distant. None met his eyes for long. They didn't need to say anything. Their silence said enough. When the last of them left, the space around him felt vast and exposed. Across the room, the man in the navy suit spoke briefly with the manager, thanked him, and handed over a card. The manager nodded repeatedly, equal parts relieved and shaken. Word would spread quickly. It always did. The woman had already gone. Outside, the night air was cool and sharp. She stepped onto the sidewalk and paused, taking a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding for hours. The city moved around her, cars passing, people laughing, life continuing without regard for boardrooms or billion-dollar deals. Her phone buzzed. A message appeared from a familiar contact, decision logged. Full withdrawal approved. Public notice at opening bell. She closed her eyes briefly, then typed a simple reply, received. She slipped the phone back into her pocket and walked on. Inside the restaurant, the man finally stood. He moved slowly now, as if afraid of drawing attention, though there was no one left to impress. He straightened his jacket out of habit, paid the bill without looking at the total, and headed toward the exit. As he passed the service station, he caught sight of the neatly folded apron resting on the counter. The memory hit him harder than any raised voice could have. The casual cruelty. The laughter. The certainty that it hadn't mattered. He stopped for a moment, staring at the fabric. Then he turned and left. The next morning arrived without mercy. Markets opened. News alerts flashed. Headlines rolled across screens in offices and cafes and living rooms around the world. The acquisition had been terminated pending ethical review. Major investors had withdrawn. Shares dipped sharply within minutes. Analysts speculated. Commentators debated. Statements were issued, polished and hollow. He sat alone in his office, watching numbers fall, watching something he had spent decades building unravel faster than he could respond. His phone rang constantly, lawyers, advisors, public relations teams scrambling to contain damage that could not be contained. Every explanation sounded weak. Every justification felt thin. At noon, a junior assistant hesitated at his door, then stepped in carefully. "There's a request for comment," she said softly. "Regarding last night." He looked at her, really looked at her, and for the first time noticed the tension in her shoulders, the careful way she chose her words. "No comment," he replied. She nodded and left. Hours later, footage surfaced. Someone had recorded part of the dinner. The insult wasn't loud, but it was clear. The word traveled quickly, stripped of context, laid bare for the world to judge. Public reaction was swift and unforgiving. Sponsors distanced themselves. Partners demanded accountability. Employees watched closely, wondering what this meant for them. By evening, the board convened an emergency meeting. Behind closed doors, voices rose, not in anger, but in fear. Risk assessments were recalculated. Reputation damage was discussed in blunt terms. The question was no longer how to recover the deal. It was whether he could continue leading at all. The vote wasn't unanimous. It didn't need to be. Across the city, in a modest office overlooking a quieter street, the woman sat at her desk reviewing reports. The role she stepped back into fit her as naturally as the uniform she had worn the night before had never truly defined her. A colleague leaned against the doorway. "It went public." She nodded without looking up. "It always does. You okay?" She paused, then smiled faintly. "I am." She closed the file and stood, stretching slightly. Outside, the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the room. "People think power is loud," she said after a moment. "But it's usually quiet. It listens." Her colleague nodded. "He never did." "No," she replied. "And that's why he lost." That night, as city lights flickered on again, the man sat in his penthouse, surrounded by luxury that suddenly felt meaningless. The room was silent except for the distant hum of traffic below. He replayed the moment over and over in his mind, the question, the laugh, the word. Stupid. He finally understood what it had cost him. Not because of who heard it, but because of who he thought didn't matter when he said it. Far below, life continued. Deals were made. Lessons were learned, some too late. And somewhere between a folded apron and a fallen empire, the truth settled into place, undeniable and permanent. Respect costs nothing. Disrespect can cost everything.